Hi there guys, welcome back to our YouTube channel. I'm Will from Global Geckos, and today we are going to be looking at Australian spiny-tailed geckos. So these are a group of geckos which, as the name would imply, come from Australia, and they are gathering interest now more so than ever before, but I still reckon that they're one of the most underrated groups of geckos that it's possible to keep as pets. So this rather magnificent beast here is Strophurus ciliaris, or the northern spiny-tailed gecko. This is certainly the largest member of the family which you're likely to find in captivity. And there are a few different subspecies. The one which you will most commonly see is Ciliaris ciliaris, the same as this one here. So this is kind of like probably nowadays the most common, but also, dare I say it, probably the coolest member of the genus as well. So all of the Australian spiny-tailed geckos are generally going to be found living in the wild in sort of arid to sort of like wooded areas, but it's certainly not a rainforest kind of environment where they would be found. It would be more sort of like dry woodland, and they are often found living behind loose bits of bark or in amongst small shrubs and things like that. They are nocturnal or certainly crepuscular in nature, but as you can see, they will sort of like actively come out and be handled should that be something that you're kind of interested in doing. From a size perspective, as I said, the northern spiny tail is certainly probably the largest one that you will come across. Most of the other members of the family are a little bit smaller, so we've got a few of the other ones here as well. So what have we got? So here is Strophurus tenicorda, also known as the golden-tailed gecko. So although they are still a spiny-tailed gecko, these ones actually have very, very limited spines on their on their tail, and they don't have any of the spines above their eyes either. Now let me just see. Yeah, there we go. But what they do have is this wonderful golden stripe running down their tail. So that is a golden striped-tailed gecko. Then we also have a couple of other types here as well. So we also have Strophurus spinagerus, and this is a little bit more similar to the Strophurus ciliaris in so much as it does have those spines on its tail and is a little bit larger as a member of the family as well. But one thing that is common with all of them is that, as you can see, they are a arboreal species. They do have those those lamellae, those sticky toe pads, but they are also handleable. So unlike some of the other species, so things like day geckos and whatnot, which definitely wouldn't sit still if you were to pick them up, most of the Strophurus are actually, they're quite chill. So they are certainly something that can appeal to keepers that may from time to time wish to handle their pet. With all of these guys, with any of the Strophurus, their general lifespan, they're probably going to live in excess of 10 years, so I would class them as a mid lifespan kind of species. They're perhaps not as long lived as some, but they're not a short-lived pet either. So as with everything, serious consideration is always required before taking on any new pet. This is Strophurus williamsi, or an eastern spiny-tailed gecko. So this is only a juvenile here, so that's why it's a little bit smaller than the others. But again, they have those spines on their tail. From a housing perspective, with any of the Australian spiny-tailed geckos, because the total size of them is no more than about sort of 12 to 14 centimetres, as I said, Strophurus ciliaris, or the northern spiny-tailed gecko, being the largest of all of them, you can comfortably keep them in a 30 centimetre by 30 centimetre by 60 centimetre high. If it is the northern spiny tail that you're keeping, you may well benefit from keeping them in the 45 by 45 by 60 centimetre high. But these glass exoterra tanks are a great option for keeping them. They are arboreal, so they want the height more so than the floor space. When it comes to providing them with the required heating and lighting, the best way of providing them with heating is definitely going to be to use some form of dome light on the top, and then into that you can use some form of like a low wattage halogen is always going to work well. Obviously that in turn is going to need to be controlled by a thermostat, such as these sort of just a standard dimming thermostat, or if you want to take it to that next level, you could use something app controlled like the Microclimate Evo thermostats. These are a great choice if you're looking for something a little bit more high tech. From a lighting perspective, as with all geckos, they are going to need access to UV light. So being a crepuscular species, I would go with the Arcadia Shade Dweller as being an appropriate bulb for them. You will find that they will actively sit out and bask during the day, so even if they are asleep, they will often choose to sleep in areas where they are sort of readily absorbing those UV rays whilst they're sleeping. You may choose to put an LED bar on there as well, so some form of plant lighting if you are going to plant up their enclosure. Although, as I said, it is a relatively arid kind of environment, so you're potentially not going to be looking at like a lush rainforest kind of style setup anyway for them. But one thing that using an LED bar will do is it will certainly increase the lux within the environment, so it will make the environment a much brighter all-round enclosure during the daytime. So it can still be worthwhile using these even if you haven't got much in the way of live plants in the enclosure. When it comes to designing the enclosure for your Australian spiny-tailed gecko, first thing to point out, your substrate, some form of sandy soil is probably going to be your best bet. Something like the BioLife Desert, that's always going to work really well. But other substrates which we like to use, things like the Leolife and the Beardy Life, they also look really good in your general sort of Strophurus enclosures. If your substrate is quite dry, do bear in mind that if you're intending on breeding them, you may have to provide some form of additional nesting site for any females, just so that they have somewhere a little bit more humid than sort of, you know, a particularly dry substrate. Once you've got your substrate in place, as far as furnishings and decor goes, in the wild, a lot of these species would be found living sort of behind loose bits of bark and things like that. So we often like to use bits of cork flats, and we will always have these vertically, and you will often find that the geckos will sort of like sit on the back of them, or perhaps sort of out on the front, actively basking throughout the day. Other things which we will always incorporate are going to be thin twigs. So again, we like these redwood roots, these are lovely, and then also sort of like finer cork branches. If you want to add live plants into your enclosure, you can do, but do bear in mind that obviously for these guys, an optimum temperature range is going to be a basking site of about 32 degrees and a general background temperature of certainly 28 to 30 throughout the day, dropping by about 5 to 8 degrees overnight. But it does mean that it's because it's quite warm in that environment, you're not going to have great success with a lot of different species of plant, but some which will work well in that environment. Things like Sansevieria or Mother-in-Law's Tongue, that's quite a good one. These are pretty robust, they can tolerate high temperatures. And then things like aloes and certainly some other sort of like succulents, so things like crassulas and echeverias will work as well. So if you want to put a little bit of live planting in there, these are going to be some of your best bet in order to kit out your enclosure and make it sort of a nice environment for your Australian spiny-tailed geckos. From a dietary perspective, any of your Australian spiny-tailed geckos, they are all predominantly insectivorous, so we tend to use a mixture of small crickets and small locusts. Always we're going to be gut loading those, and then we're also going to be dusting them with some form of calcium and multivitamin supplement. We do like to use the Earth Pro A simply because this is a good base and it doesn't contain any dietary D3, so where we always provide them with good UV lighting, you shouldn't need to use much in the way of soluble D3. Should you need to though, the revitalized D3 is a nice one to use, and that could be used certainly sort of every couple of weeks just as a little bit of a top up. In terms of other dietary things, we have found from time to time that our spiny-tailed geckos will actually eat a little bit of some of the artificial diets that are designed for sort of like crested geckos. Whether they're doing that necessarily for nutrition or for hydration, we're not too sure, but the fact that they will eat it from time to time when offered means that maybe sort of once a fortnight or so we will offer them a small serving of it just to see if they like it. If not, you tend to find that the live food within the enclosure will always go and eat it. So it certainly adds from a gut loading perspective, even if the animals themselves aren't eating it. As you can see with any of the Australian spiny-tailed geckos, they are actually relatively handleable, which I can't stress enough how unusual this is for a small arboreal gecko to actually be something that you can pick up and handle from time to time. So they are really quite a calm species, or quite a calm group of species to keep. Something worth bearing in mind is that within their tail they actually have the capacity to squirt a sticky glue-like substance. They will do this by arching their tail up over their back, and they can sort of almost squirt it certainly sort of 30 to 50 centimetres from themselves, and they will do this to deter predators. Quite interestingly, it is actually ever so slightly toxic as well, this glue-like secretion, and although certainly with the northern spiny-tailed geckos like this one here, the Strophurus ciliaris, it's not going to do anything. They have actually classed the Strophurus tenicorda, or the golden striped-tailed gecko, as being the only medically significant out of the family, and potentially, according to literature, it can promote a drop in blood pressure and induce shock. So it's not something that you want to get in your mouth or your eyes, but as you can see, they're not really likely to do it. It's something just to bear in mind that, you know, if they were to get particularly afraid, they can do it, and not to be alarmed that if they do sort of squirt this sticky like glue, that's just their natural defensive mechanism. That may potentially explain why they're not too rapid in their general demeanour, because they do have this kind of like this ace up their sleeve for defence. So because of that, it means that on the whole they can be a much calmer species, and as you can see, they're all pretty handleable. So I would definitely recommend these as being a quite a cool, different, unusual species to keep, and they're definitely not out of the realm of being a beginner gecko species either.